So today we're going to be looking at rename in our reset series. And the biggest question in that is, what's in a name? What is in a name? We all have been given names, obviously, from birth. And, we think about different names like company names, those kind of things. But how much weight does a name carry? Like, for instance, have you ever ordered anything from Relentless? I guarantee you have. In fact, if you put in relentless.com, you'll quickly be redirected to Amazon. Or maybe you've done a search, but I doubt that you've ever wanted to know something and back rubbed it. But that was the original name of Google. There's many of them like that. If you do Instagram, Instagram was originally bourbon. So what would you call that? Do you have an Insta? You would say, do you have a burb? It just seems that it would be kind of crazy to have it that way. Or then there's the long-winded Jerry and David's Guide to the World Wide Web. Thankfully, they changed that to Yahoo. Or Brad's Drink, which actually now is known as Pepsi. Or how about Blue Ribbon Sports? Blue Ribbon Sports today is known as Nike. Or maybe you like to get your favorite drink from Cargo Cafe. Thankfully, that's now called Starbucks. There are many like that. There's Pete's Super Submarines, which is actually Subway now. And maybe you like to just kind of chill out on your couch and just binge watch Netflix. Well, thankfully for the name change, because you would have been saying that you were going to binge watch Kibble. So names can really affect the outcome of things. They can change, make or break a destiny. And that's what's important about names. And in fact, in biblical times, names had a meaning. So when you introduced yourself to someone, you would say your name, they would immediately know something about you. For instance, my name means well-born or noble. Obviously, I'm not a nobleman, so that's not really applicable for us today. But unfortunately, for the story we're going to look at today, for Jacob, that wasn't such a great experience because his name meant deceiver and supplanter. And that made it hard for him. But what I want you to see today is that while these names of these companies might have had a change in their destiny, in the Bible, when a name change was given, there was a change in destiny always. And that's what we're going to look at today. But before we get started in that, I want to ask you a question. What was your name before you accepted Christ? And those could be names such as thief, addict, liar, cheater, worthless, a gossip. There are many names that we all have been called, that we have answered to all of our lives, that weren't such great names. So I want you to think about the name before you accepted Christ. And then I want to ask you this, do those names still try to get a foothold in your life? Because they can. What name might be playing in your head when you're laying in bed stressed out late at night and can't sleep? What name are you hearing? If you're a believer, the good news is, just like with Jacob, you've been given this new name and a new destiny. Today, we're going to see that in Genesis 32. That's where Jacob received his new name. But the problem for us, I think, sometimes is that we have a tendency to forget the new name that God's given us. And we'll start answering to those old names. And that's the problem. Because when we do that, we lose our true identity. And when we lose our true identity, we start trying to play God in our own lives. So just a little background on where we're going with this, just about Jacob. Jacob was a very strong and passionate man. There's a story in there about him lifting this well lid, this huge stone that they said would take 2 or 3 men to lift. So clearly he had a lot of physical strength. He was a man of complete self-reliance and resourcefulness, but oftentimes it was through deception. Remember, his name meant deceiver. He took his brother's birthright and then later took his brother's inheritance. And as he got older and he started to seek a wife, he went to try to get his wife, and he himself was tricked into working for 7 years for a bride that he really didn't want. Not once, but then a second time, he had to work another 7 years to have the bride that he wanted. So then, in normal fashion for Jacob, he decided that he was going to trick his uncle out of most of his livestock and slip away in the night. So he was already under a lot of pressure at this point because his uncle, who he had deceived, was bad, behind him. And then in front of him, he knew that he was about to meet with his brother Esau, who he also had stolen from. So he was in a very tough place. We look at the scripture, chapter 32, verses 22 through 24. During the night, Jacob got up and took his wives, his servants' wives, and his 11 sons and crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all of his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. The first thing I want you to see here is that we will fight for our old name. Jacob here, keep in mind, is completely alone in the darkness, facing death from his brother. He has let go of everything he holds dear. It's now on the other side of this river. All of his possessions, his family, everything that he holds dear is gone. And then a man, who we later find out is God, comes to wrestle with him all night. And this struggle that they had, this wrestling match, is very symbolic of our own personal struggles with sin and death. We tend to wrestle between following and trusting God's plan and trying to play God ourselves in our own lives. Jacob was continuing to rely on his same old ways here. You'll see that he tries to rely on his old name, his physical strength, thinking that he can outdo the man that he's wrestling. And when things are tough, we are much in the same in that we have the tendency to try to handle things on our own as well. You see, our old name can be like that favorite old pair of shoes or that favorite old t-shirt that we have. We hold on to those because they have fit us comfortably for so long, and we find comfort in their familiarity. And we can do the same thing with those old names. When times are tough, it's easy to run back to what we knew or what we were. But God has given us a new name, a brand new wardrobe that we can wear that is a sight for all to see. And we should desire to show that to the whole world. We need to stop wrestling with our old identity. Verse 25 says that when the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. And then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Clearly right here, when we're in pain, we need to look to God for a new name. That's what we need to do. We need to look to God for that new name. When we realize that we don't got this, that's when we should cry out to God. And for Jacob, dislocating his hip, that's a wrestler's pivot point of strength. When he dislocated his hip, all of his abilities, all of his physical abilities, his natural strength was taken away. And it forced him to prayerfully cling to God's grace. And what does Jacob do? He cries out for a blessing. It says in Hosea 12, verse 4, yes, he wrestled with the angel and won. He wept and pleaded for a blessing from him. There at Bethel, he met God face to face, and God spoke to him. What a beautiful picture. We should model Jacob's reaction whenever we face these overwhelming odds. We should cry out to God and refuse, like Jacob, to let go until the Lord blesses us. It says in Lamentations 3:40 and 41, instead, let us test and examine our ways, and let us turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to God in heaven. That's what we're called to do in those times. We need to stop trying to do things on our own and trust in God. Verse 27 says, what is your name? The man asked. And he replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and men and have won. Jacob had to introduce himself to God by his name. That meant that Jacob had to introduce himself to God as saying, when God said, who are you? Jacob had to say, I'm a deceiver, a supplanter. He had to admit his guilt to the Lord. And the phrase will no longer be in the Hebrew, it literally means that it shall no more be said, which indicates a spiritual transformation has taken place for Jacob. The same spiritual transformation that takes place for us when we accept Christ and he gives us our new name. And the name Israel, which God gave to Jacob, that name transformed him from a deceiver into a prevailer. But I want you to understand that Jacob was prevailing on his own to some degree prior to this, much like we did too before we accepted Christ. But the difference is that now Jacob is prevailing not with trickery and deception, but with God. And the third thing is this: a new name comes with a new destiny. We see that Jacob handles things differently whenever he does meet with his brother Esau in the next chapter, in chapter 33. And Jesus, even himself, had renamed many people in the Bible. We see that he renamed Simon to Peter, and it goes on and on. Abram, originally in the Old Testament, became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. These name changes all indicate this change in destiny. All of these people went on to do great and mighty things for the Lord because of this name change. In fact, Jacob's descendants eventually become the 12 nations of Israel. And for us, by clinging to God, we can overcome those insurmountable odds. That's what he did. Jacob overcame. He wrestled with God and won. It was a crippling victory, but he won because of God. And we can do the same. And verse 29 says, "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Even today, the people of Israel don't eat the tendon near the hip socket because of what happened that night when the man strained the tendon of Jacob's hip. See, even here, even now, after wrestling with him all night, Jacob is still struggling to come to terms with who the man was. We do the same thing. We struggle with God, and sometimes we lose clear sight of who's in charge, us or him. And we can forget who God is and who we are and who we belong to. The man's reply to Jacob is just another way of saying, "Don't you know who I am?" After having wrestled him all night, it would seem to us that he would know that was God. But God's mercy allowed a victory for Jacob. But it was a crippling victory. You see, that crippling victory made him become reliant on the Lord. That limp stays with him, but now he is walking in spiritual strength instead of physical strength. And for us, it's the same way. We are often left with scars or remnants from our struggles and our past sins, but they are reminders of the need for God. And they're reminders that the source of strength for us is not in ourselves. It's not natural, but it is spiritual. And Jacob's limp is noticeable by all as a change. And when we have changed, when we have accepted that new name, people take notice of us as well. They see us differently. We may not have a limp, but they see that something's different. And you can't argue with a changed life. And it's very similar to Paul's weakness when he talks about his thorn that he prayed 3 times that the Lord would remove. In 2 Corinthians 12:10, he says this. He says, "When I am weak, then I am strong." That was the same for Jacob, and that's the same for us. When we're weak, we're made strong because we realize the dependency that we have on the Lord. And we have to rely on his strength and not our own. And we have to trust in the new name that he has given us and not the old names that we answered to. So what do we do? What do we need to do with this? First of all, we need to remember that we have a new name. And we saw God ask Jacob, and Jacob asked God. And so now I'm going to ask you, what is your new name? Is it forgiven, chosen, child of God, accepted, worthy, loved? What is your new name? What is the name that you should be answering to and ignoring all of the old names? What name are you going to choose to answer to? When we face struggles, we must cling to and refuse to let go of Christ. We cannot let go of our new names because that's our new identity and that's our new purpose and that's our new destiny. We cannot allow our circumstances to tell us who or what we are or who we belong to. And if you've never been given that new name, if you've never accepted Christ, and experience the new names of child of God, or forgiven, or belonging. If you've never experienced that and you want to experience that, there will be an opportunity for you in just a few moments to take action on that. And I encourage you to do it. Get that name change. Get that destiny change. Find that new identity in Christ and get rid of that old wardrobe. I encourage you to do that, because when we hold on to our new name, we shine brighter in the eyes of the world, because we are refusing to answer to who the world tries to say we are. And instead, we answer to who God says we are. We answer to the truth. And that shines so brightly in this world. And finally, I just encourage you this. Wear the new name proudly, so that everyone you would see would also see God's work in you and through you. Have a great week. God bless.